Hi, everyone. Joining us today is Dr. Dominic Parrott, who is currently a professor in the Department of Psychology at Georgia State University and the Director of Clinical Training and Chair of the Clinical Psychology Program. He is one of the faculty for the Center for Research on Interpersonal Violence through Georgia State University. A focus of his work is on alcohol-related aggression, intimate partner aggression, and campus sexual violence. As is normal for my show, we take a winding road and cover many topics that are simply not talked about enough in our society. I hope this opens a doorway for you to making these conversations more comfortable for you. Thanks for joining us. I'm not the house of cards that falls down easily. I'm strong enough to handle what you throw at me. Welcome to Mental Health News Radio. I'm your host, Kristen Sunanta Walker. Just what are we going to discuss? The intimacy that is mental health. Let's continue to make it as comfortable as discussing brain health or heart health. This show has been on the air for several years and we have amazing co-hosts. And then we created a network of podcasters on mentalhealthnewsradionetwork.com, a place where every possible facet of mental well-being can be talked about openly. My show? After several hundred interviews, the format is this: intimate, deep, funny, touching, sometimes uncomfortable, but always vulnerable conversations with interesting people. The goal is to have you, our listening family, many of you who have become my good friends, feel as though you are listening in on private conversations. Thank you for tuning in and becoming part of this amazing journey with me and now with our network of podcasters. Just knowing this podcast might be helping any of you realize you are not alone on this journey called being a human being makes doing this podcast worth every second. After all we promised, we'd be cordial. Good morning, listeners. I am here with Dr. Dominic Parrott. Dominic, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I want our listeners to get an idea, they've heard the introduction about what you do, but I always love to ask before we get into our winding road conversations, why this specific research and this focus in your career? Why did this end up being what it is that you do?
I've been asked that question a number of times. The truly personal answer is as an undergraduate at the University of Pittsburgh, knowing I wanted to go into clinical psychology and psychology more generally, I was talking with one of my professors who was giving me some ideas of different research labs I could work in. And none of them really they didn't strike me until she said, well, a colleague of mine does research on alcohol use and smoking, and participants come into their lab and drink alcohol and they measure how that affects them. And it was kind of like immediately, without much thought, I was like, that sounds really interesting. I didn't have at the time a whole lot of, I just knew I was attracted to that. And I think over time, as I went to graduate school and have been here at Georgia State for a number of years, it's just become clear to me that in our culture and in other cultures, people drink alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
Not everybody drinks, but people drink. It's ingrained in our culture.
Right.
And
not everyone becomes aggressive or violent either.
That's right. That's right. And but the negative impact of alcohol is real and far-reaching. And what I've unfortunately come to know over the years is we don't have really great interventions,
right,
or approaches to reduce alcohol-related violence. And so the work in this area, I think, is just, not just really interesting to me, just kind of naturally, but the public health relevance, I think, is just kind of unquestionable, undeniable.
Absolutely. That, I think, being in the field that I'm in, where I talk to, the show is Mental Health News Radio. So any topic under that header, which is large, is up for conversation. And I have not had a conversation about alcohol and aggression before, which I think is interesting.
Yeah.
And my listeners know, things that come into play into my life will also come into play into this particular show. So I've certainly been around people in my family who have had an issue with alcohol and aggression, but I haven't dealt with that in my personal life in a long time, and I'm approaching 50, until recently, where I had something happen with a female who is older than I am and who definitely has been drinking hard alcohol for a very, very long time. But I had never been around them over a long period of time, several hours while they were drinking. And it was interesting to see. It was interesting and also frightening and traumatizing to watch tiredness, maybe jet lag, stress in their life, plus drinking during the day all the way to the evening, and watching their behavior get worse and worse and worse, and then direct that behavior at me.
Yeah.
It was frightening. And to be in a position of, I didn't know what to do. There really wasn't a way for me to call for help. Other people that were there were coming to me because this person kept passing out on the drive that we were all doing. Thank God they weren't driving, but other people were sort of coming to me and saying, "Oh, you need to be careful. Your friend, she drank a lot," that kind of thing. And
Yeah.
I felt completely trapped, and in a sense I was. And what you do, because when someone is that drunk, and this is a long time, it's not just one time, a long standing drinking problem. There's no controlling their behavior or telling them, "Hey, you're drinking anything is going to incite their anger."
Yeah, I mean that there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
And maybe we can kind of take it piece by piece and see
Great.
where we go. But the first thing in that example is, at least if I'm hearing you correctly, is that the person we're talking about had a long-standing, what we'll call an alcohol use disorder, or what kind of, in the lay public, they'll say, "Oh, that person's an alcoholic."
Right.
And so this is someone who's drinking frequently, and when they're drinking heavily, and they're that kind of person that after they've consumed so much alcohol, like something just kind of switches, where
Right.
they're just kind of, there's no turning back in that particular day or episode. And the first thing we talk about with how do you reduce or address alcohol related violence, it is to not drink, right?
Right.
Pretty simple.
Right.
And a lot of the work that's been done to reduce alcohol related violence, for instance, in couples, right, where one of the partners is a heavy drinker, is to do psychosocial interventions, therapy essentially, or couples therapy, to help that person stop drinking.
Right.
Or at least reduce their drinking to a significant level. And those interventions might focus on the individual person. They might use the couple or the relationship as a good supportive framework for helping that person to reduce or stop their drinking. And these interventions have shown some success, right? And that's a good thing. So if we can have people stop drinking, then you can't have alcohol cause violence. The other thing, and this doesn't flow exactly from what I just said, but what do you do when you're in that situation where someone's just kind of so far past the line, and
right.
And it can feel helpless, or like to not really know what to do. A lot of our work has focused on people who are drunk, but let's just say not so drunk that they're just like unable to really process what's going on.
Right.
People at blood alcohol levels, between 0.08 and 0.1 or 0.11, which is clearly drunk, above the legal limit for driving in most, if not every state.
Right.
Where there's definitely a lot of impairment, but, by and large, people are still able to kind of like sit up straight if they have to, although they might wiggle back and forth a little bit, or
Right.
And with those folks at that level of intoxication, and I can talk about this more in depth later. We what we're looking at a lot of times is what people are focusing on in their environment, how they're processing information in their environment.
Mm-hmm.
The person you were describing, it's almost as if they're not really processing what's going on. They're just moving in some direction, and who knows what's going to happen.
Right, and it becomes like a feral animal situation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that ties back again. I hear how that can feel really helpless. And I've been in that sort of situation where someone was in that kind of a state, and it's like, what do you do?
Right.
And I just think that like the safety of that person and the safety of others, however you can accomplish that.
Right.
There's no, I don't think necessarily silver bullet answer, but how can you and other people in that situation work together to kind of help keep everybody safe?
Right.
And that's kind of related to the idea of kind of bystanders and other people in situations who can be of help, which is something we've also began to study.
Right. I saw the bystander intervention for sexual violence on your university website. So, well, is there a difference in maybe types of alcohol that can trigger, like if it's wine or beer or whatever, can alcohol play a role, the type of alcohol play a role in the nature of someone's violence or triggering that violent part of their alcoholism?
Yeah, that's a question that is sometimes asked because, people will have the experience of, when so-and-so drinks whiskey,
mm-hmm.
look out, but if they're drinking beer, don't look out as much or they're fine or something like that. And there's been a few studies that have tried to compare, spirits or kind of white clear liquor versus, like a whiskey that would be kind of brown or darker in color
mm-hmm.
versus beer. And, my read of those studies, and there might be others who disagree with this, but my read of those studies is it's kind of equivocal. I don't really see really compelling evidence that a particular type of alcohol is going to be the one to trigger aggression and another type of alcohol isn't.
Okay.
And if in fact that, if we were to snap our fingers and conduct the 100 best studies to answer that question, and we found out that, it's beer that causes people to be aggressive and not wine and more hard liquor. The reality of that is, okay, that's important to know, but what we know even more is that alcohol, that there's a pharmacological effect of alcohol, that at the end of the day, I think regardless of what people are consuming, that's going to exert the most impact on aggression. Maybe there's some additive effect of what you're drinking. Again, I don't
and I would think it's
evidence for that.
Yeah, I think it's so personalized. I don't think it could be, and everyone drink red wine because it won't make you aggressive. I think it's down to that individual person and their body chemistry. So, I was thinking, well, if this person drank wine or, someone drank wine and they did okay, not that they should be drinking at the level that that someone that has a severe alcohol problem would drink wine, but maybe yes, for them individually, if they got a hold of some country's version of moonshine, then all bets are off. But
part of what you're bringing up is, I think most people could identify with the idea of if someone has an alcohol use disorder, that abstinence is the way to go. Like the AA model, Alcoholics Anonymous model. And, I don't think you're going to find a few people who will dispute that if someone has an alcohol use disorder, that being abstinent, is the most surefire way to prevent the problems they've been having. But there's a lot of evidence that supports the fact that people can not be abstinent, but reduce their drinking. And this leads to general, what we call harm reduction. So, instead of drinking 12 drinks each night, maybe they're drinking 2 drinks each night. So they're not abstinent, but they're not drinking to levels that are going to lead to a lot of these problems that they're experiencing and problems for others. And the way to think about this is, if someone's on the highway, and not literally on the highway, but like on the metaphorical highway of trying to change their drinking behavior, there's different exits on that highway. Some of the early exits are reducing your drinking, or reducing how often you drink, or reducing what you drink to try to limit the negative impacts of your use. But at the end of that highway is the abstinence exit, right? And that's always kind of where things are headed. But for some people, they can get off at an earlier exit and be just fine.
Right.
And so it's a kind of a person by person approach to see what works for them. And a lot of people change their drinking on their own without any or much help from professionals in the mental health or health field, and end up doing just fine.
Right. I remember Paul Newman talked about, and people would try to get him to say, well, are you an alcoholic? And he'd say, no, or he wouldn't even say no. He would just say, I just found I was enjoying it too much. And, like you said, he was someone that stopped drinking on his own and didn't want to talk publicly because it was none of the public's business. But anytime someone would try to bring that up, he's kind of known for his way of handling it, which is somewhat like the smart recovery way.
Right.
Who we've interviewed, Tom Horvath on the show many times, who's the founder of Smart Recovery, talking about, how their focus is on the why, what's underneath, what are the reasons why we're drinking. Right. They aren't an abstinence only model, but yeah, I definitely have found that interesting when people, not everyone has to go to AA.
Right. Yeah, no, that I agree with that completely. Yeah.
So if we're talking about, what I'm curious to know too is the long-term effect and use. Obviously, family history of drinking comes into play, genetics, things like that are all studied, I know. But have you seen in your studies where someone gets to a point where either they're behaviorally, they are so used to their behavior from this, lifetime of drinking, that they actually believe that it's okay or accepted just because they've been doing it so long, and not listened to their daughter, their friend, their whatever, that has said, you are an alcoholic or you have a drinking problem. So they've sort of normalized it in their own brain? Or is it more that they don't, the alcohol has made such changes to brain chemistry that they really don't remember how awful they are when they're inebriated?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, I'll preface by saying that, where my work is focused, well, I'll say where my work has not focused and where I don't really have that expertise is, it is those long-term effects of alcohol use on kind of brain chemistry and changes in cognition and that sort of thing.
Okay.
But what I would say, I guess somewhat from an armchair, knowing kind of the research literature on kind of psychological or behavioral interventions for alcohol use disorders, that, a lot of people know what the effect of their drinking is.
Okay.
So that's not to say all people, right? There's obviously, individual variation and such, but I think my impression is that most people who have problems with their alcohol use know that it's a problem and know the effects it's having. They might not know fully the effects, or but they have a pretty good sense. Now, there's terms in the field like denial and
right.
and people like not accepting what those harms are or trying to rationalize them. But I think by and large, people kind of know at some level. It's not as if they just have really, that's how I am. I didn't know that.
Right.
They've done it enough. They've gotten the feedback. They've heard it.
Right. From people who've been on the receiving end. Right.
Yeah. And if somebody's still drinking and experiencing all those sort of problems and having those sort of effects, they really, haven't reached that point or that tipping point where they are ready to make changes. One thing I'll talk to students about is, we all do things for a reason. Like, pick whatever behavior you engage in, drinking or anything else. Like, there's a reason you're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
It might not benefit you in the long term, right? But there's at least a short-term reward. And I mean, alcohol and drug use is a great example of that, where people know at some level that it's causing these problems, but there's some other motivation that's, at least for that period of time, stronger that leads them to continue to drink.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the motivations that you found in your research as to why someone would continue?
Well, what we're studying in our research is more focused on how alcohol is impacting aggression as opposed to what's motivating problematic alcohol use. But there's different motives for people to drink. Two examples are, social motives. So think of, somebody who's out with friends and everybody's having some drinks, or says, oh, let's go to this club together. And so you're drinking as kind of that social lubricant. That's
right.
What's kind of impelling you to drink alcohol, and maybe to drink more than you want. There's also kind of broadly what we might refer to as coping motives, which is where people, I think a good example of this is people have a lot of negative emotion. And that could be anger, depression, anxiety, etc. And their way to cope with that is through alcohol, because it's pretty good at that. Alcohol reduces our anxiety,
right,
and makes us feel better
for a short period, right?
Yeah. So it works for that, but is that the way you want to cope with your anxiety?
Right.
Maybe there's some other non-pharmacological, more adaptive ways to cope.
Right. And there are ways, I think, that you can learn. Like, I now know, okay, well, if someone is extremely angry in their just daily life, what they write is very angry and personal, and the way that they talk about other people is very angry and personal and intolerant. If they also tell me that they drink a lot, that is not someone I would want to hang out with.
Yeah. And, with respect to aggressive behavior, you kind of hit on one of the kind of key things we've learned in the past few decades with research, both work I've done and the work of many others in this area, which is that, who's going to become aggressive when they get drunk?
Right. Let's go into that. Yeah.
It's like one of those $1 million questions. And the short answer is there's no silver bullet answer either, because unless the answer can be that it's complicated. But, a piece of that, who's going to become most aggressive, or who's most likely to be aggressive when they're drinking, in many ways comes down to that person's kind of dispositional tendencies. So, to paraphrase what you said a moment ago, the person who kind of is really angry all the time, or kind of expresses that a lot, if you find out what they're drinking tonight, like, you don't want to be around them.
Right.
Kind of what you're getting at is that, you don't want all those tendencies to come out tenfold.
When they have a disinhibitor like alcohol in their system.
Exactly. We oftentimes say that alcohol doesn't push our foot on the gas pedal. It makes us do things we otherwise wouldn't do. That, in contrast, what alcohol is really doing is taking our foot off the brake. And it's kind of unleashing those underlying tendencies. And whether it's a tendency, very specifically towards aggression, or whether it's a tendency to be more angry or combative, or whatever it might be. It's kind of unleashing kind of what's just beneath the surface.
Right. I thought that was really interesting too. I did have a situation where I wasn't the receiver of the violent behavior, but I was with someone, and you can talk about two people having in the same place and the same experience, but having a much different journey.
Yep.
I become happier, that's my natural resting state in life. And then alcohol just enhances my already, hey, the song Red, Red Wine, that would be, typically me. But I was there with a friend and I'm having a great time dancing and having fun. And my friend is assaulting the bartender with a wine bottle. This is years and years ago, and
Right.
getting arrested. And I don't notice because I'm having so much fun. I don't notice what's going on until I see police lights and go, she's been taken away,
Yeah.
So, it's fascinating. And I'm not saying my way or that person's way was any, better to your body, to each of our individual bodies, but our behavior, where it came out, I'd say that goes into play with some people really cannot drink. Not that any of us should, but they really cannot because they become a danger to society, which is exactly what you.
Yeah. And, I mean, thank you for sharing that example, because it provides a great example to explain why two people drinking, and I don't know whether you had more than her or about the same amount, but
no, not as much. I didn't realize how much I was having wine and she was knocking back vodka and something else. So,
well, to simplify the example and make it, imagine if a scenario where you're both kind of drinking about the same amount.
Mm-hmm.
You're in the same environment, but you have two very different reactions. One person becomes very aggressive, the other person is just having a lot of fun and very kind of carefree. And you could also envision a situation where the same person, you drink on Friday night and you're carefree, and you drink in a pretty similar environment on Saturday night and you're very aggressive. So you can have these differences between people. You can also have differences within the same person, right? And again, that's where it's complicated comes into play.
Right.
What accounts for that? And our work is informed by a theory that was proposed a few decades ago called alcohol myopia theory. And essentially, this theory states that when people drink, their attentional focus becomes narrowed. And you mentioned how, you were dancing and you didn't notice.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll infer from that your attentional focus was probably narrowed to what was really salient and of interest to you, which was kind of cues of having fun and the other people on the dance floor, and maybe even things internal to yourself, like I really love to do this. I'm gonna have a great time tonight. That's something maybe you value or you're looking forward to. And so that's what you're focused on. And so that's doing two things. Number one, it's allowing you to have that behavioral and emotional experience of having fun generally.
Mm-hmm.
But it also means you're not focused on the other stuff going on at the bar or the club, right?
Right.
So much so that you don't notice what's going on until there's police lights.
Right.
And so that's a great example of alcohol myopia. And now we could take that and apply it to your friend. And maybe making some inferences about what's going on with that person. Maybe they have a lot of experiences or learned behaviors or attitudes that are really kind of hostile in nature. That people are out to get you. And that bartender, they gave me this face, and so they're out to get me. They're going to do something to my drink, or what. I mean, you could kind of come up with examples like this. And so when you drink, what cues in the environment are most salient to you? It's these ones that can be interpreted in a hostile way. And if all you're doing is walking around seeing hostile, threatening cues, aggression suddenly doesn't seem like such a, not that
A
it's a good
large leap.
response, but it's not, that's right. It's not too large of a leap anymore.
Right.
So this idea of alcohol myopia kind of explains why alcohol can have so many different effects. If the person's behavior is really driven by their attention to what they're perceiving in their environment, for different people, different cues are going to be more salient, and for different reasons.
Yeah, and that goes all the way back to what we talked about before, which is if that person in their life, when you're around them, they're not drinking, they're angry, hostile,
Mm-hmm.
Everyone's out to get me. I'm the moral authority on everybody's behavior, and I'm going to point out bad behavior in everyone, whatever it may be. Drinking is more likely to, I guess what you're saying is it doesn't have to, because it depends on person to person, but more likely to enhance their natural resting state behavior, which is this anger or judgment
Right.
or intolerance for other people.
Yeah, no, that's it. We published a paper a number of years ago that we called "The Disguise of Sobriety," which essentially kind of provided some empirical support for this idea. And that idea of the disguise of sobriety is that it's, when we're sober, we're able to keep some of those things at bay. Maybe.
Right.
In some cases, maybe not. But it's that when we're drinking and alcohol functions as that disinhibitor, it helps to unleash some of that. And, the important thing to recognize here, though, is that, again, some people who have those tendencies drink alcohol and those kind of negative or aggressive inclinations don't come out.
Right.
But it's not invariable. It doesn't happen across every situation. And again, there's variation. It happens for some people more than others, but it's this idea that that alcohol functions to disinhibit our behavior, but it's also tied to those cues that we're seeing in our environment.
Yeah. I found this interesting with my ex-husband, who is not a drinker by any means. He's actually very opposed to alcohol, and he also can't drink. I mean, meaning he can have half of a beer and he's loop-de-loo. His system doesn't process it well, but he's someone who tends to be more angry and opinionated and so on in his regular life. But he also is someone that deals with chronic pain.
Mm-hmm.
And so for him, I was worried at some point, well, I'm glad that he doesn't drink, because my God, he would be even more angry potentially. And what was interesting was, no, he became more calm, more relaxed, more the few times that he would. And I thought, oh, that's fascinating, because it's lessening the pain he's feeling. And the pain is what drives his anger. It's not that the underlying disposition of him is this angry person, because it isn't. The pain
Right.
drives it. So I see what you mean with the differences and how it's different for each, that's person.
Right. Yep, that's right.
Well, in terms of your, with your work, what are some of the outcomes so far? As I know you work with Georgia State University, you're doing work, aggression towards sexual minorities, bystander intervention for sexual violence. I mean, there's so much work that you're doing. Where are you wanting to see this work taken?
Well, it can go in a lot of different directions. And I'll say, generally, both for myself, but I also think where the field is going and trying to go is to develop better interventions. It's one thing to say, hey, alcohol is a contributing cause of violence. Okay, we know that. It's another thing to say, in who's most susceptible, what situations put people at most risk, and we're learning and know a lot more about that than we did years ago. But it hasn't quite translated into really effective interventions, whether at the individual level or kind of the public health level. And I think that's a direction we really need to be able to go.
Right. And I want listeners to understand, we're not, when we say the word violence, and maybe I'm sure you mean it this way too, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's, sexual violence, there's physical violence, but please don't knock emotional violence, and that is definitely a factor as well. You can be traumatized to your core and in fear of your life by someone's level of emotional violence at you when they're drunk as well. So when we say the word violence, or at least when I do, I'm not just talking about physical forms of violence.
That's right. And when you talk about emotional violence, without the person ever touching you.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And, we use, just as a kind of side note, we define aggression as any behavior that, has an intention to harm the other person who's motivated to avoid it. And so when I say any behavior, that, that could be the traditional, like a punch or a push, but it can be words. It doesn't even have to be words. It can be nonverbal, right? It's any behavior that has that intention, that can cause harm to a person. So I very much agree with you in having that broad umbrella in terms of what sort of behaviors we're talking about.
Yeah, and there can be a determinant that I've seen with different people, and I've certainly heard about, where they are so used to their behavior, or they're inebriated and they're not really watching their behavior at this point. Maybe they're going to feel horrible about it as they become more sober, but where they can blast you and then 5 minutes later say, "Oh, do you want a donut?" Like nothing happened, and you're sitting there just like, you've just been slammed, and they're now asking you if you want a piece of pie or some peanuts, and you're just like, did you not just witness yourself screaming at me in front of 1,000 other people, and there's no connection there when they're drinking. And maybe there isn't a connection there when they aren't drinking too. It could be that they are actually that aggressive without the alcohol, and you just don't know.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And if I can, just to kind of go back, you're asking about kind of future directions.
Absolutely.
One of them is absolutely, I'll just say broadly, kind of intervention development. Two other areas where I think the field needs to go, and where our work has been focused more specifically, is first, I've done a lot of work with couples and in violence within intimate relationships. But up until about a year ago, that was really focused on heterosexual couples and opposites, couples who were
opposite gender,
male assigned and female assigned at birth, right?
Right.
But we are decades behind when we think about sexual and gender minority intimate relationships.
Right.
And we have a project that we just started in the last year focused on that population and how alcohol and minority stress play into violence in those relationships. So I think that's an area that just needs all the best science that we can give it.
Absolutely. I mean, especially, yes, absolutely. My experience is nothing in comparison to what some of my friends who are in the LGBTQI plus community have dealt with, and my friends who are minorities have dealt with. It's at a whole other level of hatred and fear that they've dealt with, just by nature of their sexual orientation and their skin color or their religious belief, or
That's right. And among many other issues is the fact that we do live in a heteronormative society, and we can't expect that what we're learning from largely heterosexual cisgender couples is just going to apply to a sexual gender minority person or a couple. And so, there's certainly risk factors or protective factors that are common across all relationships, like relationship commitment and satisfaction, or someone's ability to cope with negative emotion. Some of those factors kind of cut across these different groups. But there's also factors that are very specific and unique to sexual and gender minorities. And the big one there is stigma, and their experience of stigma, and whether the extent to which they internalize that, and then how that compounds the stressors that any couple is already coping with, and how that can lead to alcohol use, and how that alcohol use can then lead to violence or vice versa. So, we need work in that area, and that's something that we've been focusing on of late.
And I'm so glad you're doing it, because you're absolutely right. When you say 10 years behind, you are right on the money. I mean, it is so behind in those areas. And sadly, we will not go down this road. I'll just put one statement out there. We don't have a lot of support with our current administration on studying this kind of violence either.
Right. Yeah, no, I hear you on that. I will say, a lot of my work is funded by the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, which is an institute within the NIH, and they've taken some, they've made some strides in trying to bring alcohol researchers together who study sexual and gender minorities, to kind of get them talking about their work and how they can kind of, in my business, like talking with other researchers, even if they don't do exactly what you do, is really helpful in informing how you think about things and how you approach your research and how you interpret data and that sort of thing. And so kind of starting to get these folks networked together, NIAAA's been making some efforts in that regard. And there are a couple NIAAA funded projects focused on violence within LGBT couples.
Right.
But all in the past couple of years,
right.
This is all just starting.
Which is unreal, but I understand. I'm glad that at least it started. It's just fascinating that only in the last couple of years.
Yeah. Yeah. With respect to violence,
right.
There's,
right.
People have been studying, doing research in this area for a long time, but certainly with respect to violence and alcohol use. The other area that we're really focusing on, and you mentioned this earlier, was bystander intervention for sexual violence. And
explain what that means, just for our listeners have
Sure. So traditionally, research and intervention efforts to reduce sexual violence perpetration, which is most typically thought of as a male to female perpetrated sexual violence situation, although you can interchange male and female in different ways. Sexual violence occurs in all those sort of dyadic combinations, but male to female sexual violence, for good reason, is oftentimes the primary focus. Traditionally, we've either worked with perpetrators to try to get them to stop, or worked with victims to try to get them to help reduce their risk or be more vigilant, or be more aware in these situations. But the kind of paradigm shift that really happened in the last, let's just say, 20 years, is this idea that in a lot of situations that precede sexual violence perpetration, there's other people around, and these are the bystanders. And just to be clear about what I'm talking about, I'm talking about the kind of classic rape scenario, where, or think of a date rape scenario, people at a party and the man's, trying to coerce or take advantage of a female and kind of gets her into the back room and she's kind of drunk and stumbling and there's people around.
Right.
So that happens.
Right.
But I'm not talking about just that. There's a continuum of sexual violence where the scenario I just described is kind of towards the more severe end of that continuum. But there's also another end of the continuum that's equally important, where maybe the female isn't even in the room. Maybe there's a couple of guys talking at 5:00 on a Friday at a bar about, oh, is so-and-so going to be at that party? And, she really wants me, and I'm going to do and they start talking about what they plan to do.
Right.
What kind of implying or maybe being explicit that no matter what she says, this is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
That's a bystander intervention opportunity.
Mm.
Not there, the threat is not imminent or proximal to that exact situation, but the other guy, one of the other guys there could intervene and say, that's not cool, man.
Yeah.
Or find a way to say, hey, I'm going to hang out with you all night tonight
Yeah.
to make sure that doesn't happen, or something to that. Like, there's different strategies people can use. We don't need to get into all those details, but the point is there's a lot of opportunities for intervention that can prevent sexual violence, downstream or upstream of the sexual assault. So that's kind of what we mean when we talk about bystander intervention. And there's been a lot of work in this area, programs developed that have a lot of evidence to support them. But what I'll focus on here is what I see as a key limitation, which is that in many sexual assault situations, alcohol use is present.
Right.
Either the victim's been drinking, the perpetrator's been drinking, both have been drinking, and the people in the environment are drinking, the bystanders are drinking.
Mm.
So for instance, we just published a paper with some colleagues at Nebraska, which surveyed women who had been sexually assaulted. And we asked them a whole range of questions about that situation and that experience. And one of the things we asked them was, for those women where there were other people around prior to the assault, we asked them how many of them were drinking, and it was like upwards of 80%. So this begs the question, if we're disseminating interventions, for instance, on college campuses, about how to be a better bystander and how to be a better pro-social member of your university community, and how to speak up, and all this. That's all great. It needs to happen. So I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing that, but what we don't know is when people learn all of this and are made more aware of all of this, does it actually work when they get into those drinking situations, given everything we know about how alcohol affects people? And I'm not saying it isn't effective, but I'm not saying it is. I'm saying we don't know.
Right.
Because nobody's developed content that tells people, hey, by the way, this is probably, when you run into the situation, you might be drinking, or someone's going to be drinking, and there's going to be an alcohol context. And here's how alcohol can prevent you or inhibit you from being a better bystander.
Right.
So we're trying to do that. We're just starting that work. Well, I don't want to say we're just starting it. We've started in the last few years, and we're continuing it kind of in scale and in scope, and trying to develop intervention content that's specific to how alcohol could affect bystanders.
That should be on every college campus, everywhere.
If evidence supports it,
right.
then yeah, check with me in 5 years. And then if the evidence supports it, I'll say, yeah, this needs to be on every college campus, or something informed by it.
Yeah, that was me. The friend that was like, don't go. I know we've been drinking or whatever, or we're having fun. Not involving substances, whatever. And there was heroin. I don't mean it that way. Just mean I was that friend that was like, don't go. This looks dangerous, taking people in the bathroom or holding someone's head over a toilet or whatever. And I didn't care who would get angry with me, but I was way in the minority.
Yep. Yeah. And the aim of a lot of these bystander programs is it's really about changing norms.
Right.
When you said you're really in the minority, the norm, and I know when I was in college years ago that I think I was under the same norm as you were talking about, that you just didn't do that, and you didn't speak up about that sort of stuff. Very few people did.
Right.
And these programs are trying to change the culture and the norms on campuses, so that becomes the thing to do.
Right.
That we look out for each other.
That makes sense. That absolutely makes sense.
And that's why it's not just applied and relevant when a guy's about to take a drunk girl into the back room. It's
right.
why it's applied when a guy's, before class starts, before the 9 a.m. lecture starts, and he makes a misogynistic joke. You should speak up against that. Right, exactly. So yes. Yeah. Yeah. Because letting those things pass, those contribute to that sort of culture that can, I want to say, kind of support or sanction
Absolutely.
male violence towards women.
Absolutely.
So
so much to talk about. Thank you, though, Dominic Parrott, for coming on and having this conversation. I want listeners to know where they can find out more about you. So everyone, you can go to violence.gsu for Georgia State University. So violence.gsu.edu to find out more information about this research and everyone that is working with you on the research. And thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show.
Not a problem. Thanks again for having me.
Absolutely. And listeners, thank you for tuning in to another edition of Mental Health News Radio. I know, no one likes commercials, but seriously, folks, without the help from these organizations, we could not stay on the air. Please give a shout out to zencharts.com. If you're a mental health or addiction treatment center, you'll want to use their EHR. It's gorgeous, and they're just good people. And also MyGenetics, MyGenetx.com, because knowing your genetic code empowers your mental health treatment. And lastly, CopeNotes.com. We love getting positive messages right to our phones every day from Johnny Crowder. He's the lead singer of Prison, a heavy metal band sharing their music about suicide prevention, addiction recovery, and mental health. See, that was painless. Support them as they support us. Back to the show.
Sometimes I'm passive aggressive, but never without good intentions. I heat up and act on my emotions.
Thanks so much for listening to Mental Health News Radio. Our podcast can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, and hundreds of other podcast apps, or you can visit our website at mentalhealthnewsradio.com. If you have a question or would like to be a guest, become a podcaster on our network, or join the amazing organizations that help keep us on the air, please email us at info@mhnrnetwork.com. Get ready for that special goodbye from our resident therapy dog, Miles, and a special thanks to Emily Sohn for letting us use her incredible song, Cordial, for our podcast music. Listen to the full song on SoundCloud at emily.sonne.
Don't be surprised when I don't hate on you. After all, we promised we'd be cordial. Sometimes in you I can fight it, but I oppose it.
Good boy.